Introduce our guests for the evening. So this is Mary Doy. And I also want to say too that, as we mentioned, we did a read and run on Clark and Division a few times before. And Mary came to our very first one, which was in 2022. Yep. And we were a small group, still pandemic-y, right? So we were a small group. We ate at a Third Coast Cafe, and Mary brought two of what would be
friends.
Friends?
Yeah.
Okay. Two friends with her who shared their experiences, and it was an absolutely wonderful time and conversation, and to learn from them. And they brought things, and you brought things too. So I expect that this is going to be equally wonderful. But to properly introduce Mary, so she's a community-based researcher, retired grant writer, and a board member with the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society. You've been doing that over 25 years? Yeah. Okay. And then she's also on the board of the low-income senior building called Heiwa Terrace, over 15 years. She's been on that board. And then she's a beginning sewer. Yeah. A fair weather knitter. I kind of want to hear more about that. And then a U.S. Census geek. Ooh. Okay. And now we have with us as well Alice Murata. She was born in Los Angeles, just like Aki. Mm-hmm. Alice spent the war years in Poston. That's how you pronounce that, concentration camp. Okay, so Poston. She resettled to Chicago in 1945. Community-based, she has been president of Highway Terrace, so you guys work together on that, Shirley, and that's a subsidized HUD facility for senior citizens. And then, and you've been a board member there for over 40 years? Incredible. Yeah. She is also one of the founders of the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society, so that's incredible. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning, she wrote this book, one of the Images of America, Japanese Americans in Chicago. This is from the Merlot Public Library, if you want to find that. I also mentioned there's the Curtis Candy. If anyone wanted to learn more about Curtis Candy, Jess has one of the books from the candy companies. But anyways, thank you both so much for being here. We're so excited to talk with you. I can jump in. One of the first things I'm curious about is that have you both read the book? And
oh yes, we know her. So,
but in 2022, so don't quiz me on
Well, I was just going to ask, but you tell me if it's been too long. But if you thought that the portrayal in the story, if that felt really accurate to what you know, to what you experienced, just if you can sort of recall, like if you read it and sort of felt like, wow, she really nailed it, or maybe not.
That's a long time ago. Yeah, I haven't read that book in ages now that you say it, and then read Evergreen too. One of the things that was interesting, though, to me, is that we do oral histories, which means that we talk to people and we, see what their lives are like and like that. And we did some oral histories for the people of Clark and Division. And we can see in her book our own interviews.
Yeah.
And it's like,
so. And actually, she cites us in the back of the book. So this is the Regenerations Resettlement Oral Histories. There are 4 sets: one done in Chicago, one in LA, one in San Diego, and one in San Jose. And so the beautician in this book that Alice interviewed appears in Clark and Division.
We see our own work in this fiction, so that's an interesting thing. But I also then wrote it out for you. It's a Regenerations project, and you can see the online archive of California, and that's the address. And then there's a left-hand column, and if you click on interviews, you can see the interview. So I thought I'll pass this around, and you can, if you have a computer, go see the thing and then compare it to Clark and Division. I mean, could do the opposite.
So read Kei Kuwahara.
No, this is one my handwriting one, and this is the one I wrote nice. But yeah, so you can read it. But I thought that might be interesting.
Yeah,
you can sort of pass them separately so that people can get them. But I thought that would be interesting for you because, the 2 that I did for here, and one was the beautician. So you compare what she says about her real situation and how it's depicted in the book. And the other person is, what is his name now? I forgot. Hiroshi Kaneko. And I wrote that name down there too. So if you read about him, he had what we call LaSalle Mansion. So the problem at the time of after the war was you couldn't find rent. You couldn't find a place to rent. And it's the same thing if you're a minority. They say the place is full, but it's empty. But they won't rent to you. Okay? So one of the ways in which they tried to help that is they would buy buildings. They would buy the building. And then they would have Japanese American tenants because they had no place to live, you know. And so where you're living today in a nice flat, we would have like 3 families, you know, in a basement 2-room apartment. You have like lots of people living there. You know, it's no place to live. But that's why if you look at that book, and I have 3 books to sell to, but if you look at the book, it has a map of Clark and Division. So it shows you all of the shops. And you can see there's restaurants, there's grocery stores, there's buildings, you know, barber shops, everything. You know, the ice cream shop, the ribs shop. But also there is shooting pool. You know, instead of going to school, you shoot pool. You know, you do some of these kinds of things. So it's an interesting place.
This is the
and
Petitions
what's interesting
interview,
about,
Keikua.
and I don't remember exactly how she said it in the book, but interesting is they have a barber shop, beauty shop, in the Mark Twain Hotel. And the Mark Twain Hotel is interesting because they don't care who comes. Okay, so the customers could be very, very wealthy people who lived on the Gold Coast. They could be the entertainers of the nightclubs and things that are right there, you know. And actually, she was offered to be a makeup artist by movies, but she didn't go because she wanted to stay here and her family was here. Okay, but you also had mafia wives. This was all Italian mafia in here, you know. And then you had the Japanese community, who she keeps saying are innocent. They have no idea who these other customers are, but they all are coming to her as customers. And she says, we don't ask them questions. We just keep our minds clear and we just do the beauty shop work, you know. But they're all friends. So there is such a thing as this Chinese restaurant, Jing, what was it, Jing? Well, anyway, it is, and they buy food and they all share food. They eat together. They even spend their holidays together, if you can imagine. That's not in the book, but she'll tell you that they even spend their holidays together. You know, I mean, it becomes sort of a community within this little beauty shop.
Well, and I think a little bit more about that interview. She describes like the mafia girlfriends, the transvestites, the Issei ladies, you know, my grandparents' generation who only speak Japanese, and her secret weapon are these Nisei who speak bilingual beauticians. So I just have this wonderful image of everybody around a table eating Chinese food. Oh, and the Moody Bible people. They're also part
the
of
Bible
it.
is here too. That's right. Yeah, she describes the. So if you read the interview, so if you want to see the actual one, I'm passing it around.
Yeah, Kei Kuwahara's.
Then you can, her name was Kei Kuwahara, and she came out of camp, and she didn't even know her birthday because her parents were gone, and she said, you know, her brother lived here, and this one lived there, and she lived someplace else, and she said, you needed to know your birthday. She said, I didn't even know my birthday. So she said, I just picked a date. And I think it was something in the summer, like June or July, because Christmas is then. Then she picked her birthday in the middle so she could get gifts. You know, I mean, she says, I picked this, you know, but her real name and her real birthday, she finds out later. I don't know that that's in the interview. But anyway, it's very interesting. And she doesn't have children, so she adopts children, you know, and buys a home, a nice home. But it's like what I told you about the Lakeview area. It's cheap when you buy it, $14,000. Now it's worth $1 million. So she buys a house, probably nicer than Lakeview because this is a nicer area. And then, you know, she wants to live there and everything, and she's ready to retire. And as she's ready to retire, she says, I went to California to look at houses and da-da-da, and I came back and I was ready to sell my house. And she said, you know what? My house was worth $1 million. I couldn't believe I was living in $1 million house. She says, she says, I decided I'm not going to move. I'm going to stay in my million. So then she says, but the other thing is, Japanese Americans are so, they volunteer. Anytime you need help, you can get them, and so she came to Heiwa Terrace when it first opened, and she got her other Nisei beauticians to come for free, and they would do the hair for these seniors for all those years. And when we opened it up later to Koreans or Chinese, they want pay. Japanese will do anything for no pay. Everybody else, you want to translate, you got to pay us, you want beauty, you got to pay us. Not Japanese, they'll do anything. You want something, even here, you want to come here and talk for nothing, okay, we'll come
tonight.
Yeah. We don't say you got to pay us, it's okay, okay. We'll find time to, come and do whatever. They're volunteers. Okay, does that answer your question?
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Mary, do you want to add anything?
Well, I was born in 1953, so I don't really have a resettlement story. But I can tell you that I have a little, so my father lived in Stockton, which is in Northern California. My mother lived in San Pedro, which is near LA in Southern California. Before people went into the incarceration camps, they were in a temporary holding pen that's called the assembly centers. So people in LA went to the Santa Anita racetracks and lived there for several months while the camp that they eventually go to is being built. Similarly for my dad. My dad's family went to the Stockton Fairgrounds. But they both families end up in Rower. So I marked all the 10 camps, and Rower is in Arkansas. The terrains vary widely in places that people were incarcerated. Rower turns out to be on farmland, and when my daughter went back in the summer, it's a soybean field. But others are on Native American reservations. Some are in the high desert of the Sierra Madre, I think. So sometimes it's beautiful but desolate, and often the extremes of weather. So that's how I would characterize Manzanar. The camp that my mom was in had torrential rains, so there was no sidewalk or anything. So, that was muddy. And that's when we went to visit on a pilgrimage, we got the sense of what it must have been like to live in camp during the rain. So from, my dad only went to the assembly center. He did not go into an incarceration camp, because he figured out a way he was a senior at Berkeley, to get accepted at a college inland. So he went to Wash U, and this is his travel permit card, so that he could go from California to Washington University, where he finished college and moved to Chicago. So he finishes in about 43 and then moves to Chicago. My mom was sort of an angry person, and she was like pissed as hell that she got put in a camp. So she leaves, and this is her little card giving her citizens indefinite leave permit. She leaves in May 26, 1943. Her own mother is dying of stomach cancer in the hospital. And my grandmother dies on August the 25th, 1943. So my mom left before my grandmother died. I don't know what it says about their relationship, or whether my mom was just so, got to get out of here. But my daughter and I found this very ghostly portrait of my grandmother in the hospital. I mean, it's really a bad copy, but if you see the original, it's also very, very, very faint. So we kind of make up a story about this, that my grandmother must have taken this either as her funeral picture or took it so that my mom and her brother, who also leave early, will have a memento of my grandmother. Mm-hmm. So sort of sometimes when you have absence of history, you can be a little bit imaginative and make it up. And then this is my grandmother's death certificate.
From camp, huh?
She died in camp.
Yeah, so that's a camp.
Yeah. It's like
because it's
Benicia County or something like that. So I don't have that much of information about my parents' story about moving to Chicago, but they did both settled on the South Side in Hyde Park. You know, and pretty typical of many Japanese Americans settling in Hyde Park. I think my mom was a secretary when she came, and my dad, you know, not only did he kind of wield his way into Wash U, but he was also very entrepreneurial. So when he comes here at the age of 21, he sets up a business, and he's at those days, I think greeting cards were wrapped in cellophane. So he has a little factory where the Issei ladies, when they come out, it can't work for him for pennies, you know. So he probably had a sweatshop. But
no, we got paid by. We were paid by piece.
This is my dad.
But we were paid by piece, and if you made 2 little bows on the greeting card, then we got a penny for 2 cards. I don't know how much the cards are sold for, but that's the kind of job I was doing as a child. In other words, you do homework. That was called homework because they were paid the minimum wage. That's true for Mexicans. I don't care who comes. And you can't live on that minimum wage, you know. And even my mother always in her whole life made maybe 10 cents over the minimum. But you can imagine how little money that is, really. And so one of the ways in which we made money was we would take homework. And homework meant, though, that the children had to work, you know. And immigrants, when they first come, children often work, because that first generation often has businesses of some sort. If you have a building, then you can't make it unless you have tenants. So you take tenants in the building, but you have to wash the sheets, you have to feed them, all these things. But children have to work to do that. Or if you have a little business at a store, they're working, you know. That's a typical thing for immigrant children, is they have to work to help make the family go, you know. And that was our situation. Therefore, more people wanted to have businesses than work for minimum wage. And they're very bright people. So, you know, you have this person telling them what to do constantly. It's like they want to be the boss. They don't want to be the worker, right? You have your own business and you can tell people what to do. So that was what they did, you know. So when you have things like a greeting card or whatever, yeah, it's piecework that they were doing, yeah. Mm-hmm. But I remember doing that kind of piecework as a child. And that's what disability people and disability elderly people do now. You know, they're not paid the growing wage, but, you know, so they have socialization or work, then you give them some kind of work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say I don't really know my parents' resettlement story. What we can talk about, did you talk about this map that Eric made? So there's a fellow that has a Facebook page called Windy City Nikkei, and he has taken telephone books and plotted where grocery stores and businesses are. So this is like 1940 to 1960, and you can really see, if you use businesses as a proxy for where people live, you can really see migration. My daughter did this also, but using telephone books for people. And so in 1940, there were about 400 people of Japanese descent that lived in Chicago. By the end of the 40s, the estimate is that there are about 20,000. So, you know, the population just boomed. Alice meant the difficulty in finding places to rent. You also have to remember that this is another time when Blacks are coming up from the South to get jobs. So it's, you know, not just discrimination against us probably, but way more harsh probably against African Americans looking for places to live.
Well, they had a harder time. Yeah, if you were Black, you had a harder time. So what the Japanese were what you call in the middle.
The buffer between Blacks and whites.
Yeah. Always.
Yeah.
And in many ways. So one of the good things about, well, one of the positive things that came out of World War II is minorities they weren't integrated. They had separate units. Japanese had their own units, Black had their own units. And of course, you don't prize them very much, so you put them into battle first. They get to go first. They get more deaths, more whatever. So they get more ribbons, more decorations because they have more dead, they've sacrificed more. But they both, blacks and Japanese, make important progresses in the war. So they'll tell you, though, even the Japanese units will tell you, we're the ones who freed the Jewish out of the camps. Now, 3 days later, 4 days later, the whites will move in. The filming is going on. So what do you see? You see the films. But the people that were there will tell you who freed them. They know because that's who, you know. So there's a difference. Okay, but the benefit of these military people is that then the jobs after the war become equal opportunity. I don't know what the term they use, but that's what it means. Pre-war in California, you had a teaching degree, you could never be a teacher. You still were on the farm. It didn't matter what kind of degree, and many of them could afford to go and did have degrees, but the jobs were still menial or nothing. But when you came to Chicago, you could get a government job, which meant you could work in the post office, or you could work as a teacher, or you could work some of these government jobs. Okay, now they're required to hire minorities. They don't really want to hire blacks. They don't really want to hire Japanese, but they'll hire token Japanese, and that's the way they make their quota. So blacks are that much not liked. Yeah, they had even harder time getting housing or whatever. So I remember as a child, there were blacks in my school, and they walked me home, but I've never been to their house because they lived farther, and that meant that they lived beyond Drexel. It's what I think, but I never went to their house or anything. But the way we lived was, yeah, and then the whites are on the other side. So even in this area, a lot of it turns black with the housing. But yeah, the Japanese are the buffers. They're being fought for on both sides. You know, blacks will tell you, it doesn't matter how nice they are to you, you're not going to be white, and you know that. And they're using you as a way of whatever. Yeah. But anyway, the positive for that is they do get better jobs. And the other good thing about coming to Chicago was pre-war, the first generation was in control. They spoke Japanese. They couldn't speak Japanese anymore. It was English in the camps. So the second generation were in charge. The second generation was becoming of age. That's why she talks about her dad going to college, and like this, you can come out and do that. If they come of age in Chicago, you could vote. They couldn't vote. If you came from Japan at the turn of the century, they could not become citizens until 1952. Okay? That's if you came from Europe, in a few years you had citizenship. Okay? So although they had prejudice against Italians or Irish or whatever, they still had citizenship, they still could vote. Asians could not. But when we came to Chicago, we had people who could vote. And the other thing is the political system here was there wasn't anybody big enough to win the election. It's not like you have so many blacks now or Hispanics now. They had to have what we call coalitions, and they liked your vote. So if you lived here, they'll tell you how you could get silk stockings or dinner or whatever if you had your vote. So the respect was given to Japanese Americans because of their vote. Okay, that's one thing. And then I was going to tell you something else about that, but anyway, that's what made a difference. So I think the life in Chicago becomes better for those two reasons: job opportunities, and then voting rights. And I think they also were thinking about that they didn't want to be farmers because pre-war they tended to be farmers, so they were willing to try some new occupation, do new things, you know. So that was what makes them different from Hawaii or different from California.
So the interview you should read is Hiroshi Kaneko, who has this Mark Twain Hotel, who really talks about, passing out silk stockings to the ladies. So pretty early on, you get a sense that the machine, is looking at this group as a possible voting bloc. But I loved Hiroshi's description.
Yes. 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 So we have a lot of Issei's who own buildings and things like that, but they have no idea what's going on in their buildings. I mean, LaSalle Mansion is a huge, huge, huge building. He doesn't keep it very long either. But there are communists living in there. There's prostitution going on in there. You can't imagine. He's innocent. He doesn't know prostitution's in there. He does not know that, the communists are there. Who does he know? He's getting the rent, I mean, that's what he cares about. But this is also a place where young Japanese guys and girls come because they live there, right? I mean, young people like to get together. But yeah, he sells it because, it's too much for him. He doesn't own it that long because he's not used to all this, And so you can imagine your grandmother, doesn't speak English, and she has this building. Now she's in jail for prostitution. She doesn't know what's going on in her building. She's in jail, okay? But yes, because you can vote, aldermen will come and get her out of there. The political system is something that it was much worse in those days than now. And they knew how to bribe. I mean, whether it was driving or owning a building or whatever, there was always underneath the table payment. I think it's harder to do today. And I have no idea how to do it. If you asked me to do it, I couldn't do it, okay? But they didn't speak English, but they knew. If the inspector came, there was something wrong with the house. I don't care what it is, okay? And you pay them off. But they never come back and check if it's done. It doesn't matter because the point isn't the improvement. Of course, they'll improve it, whatever the thing is, in case they come back. But yeah, you pay it off, and then no problem. Okay, it's always a payoff.
So I think this shows the strength of oral history. That if you have great rapport with your narrator, you can get these kinds of stories. I'd say that, as somebody who's done oral histories in other contexts, for me as a younger woman, like I look like their daughter. I'll never get the sexual deviancy stories or the bad stories. So we know our limits too. Alice can get the eating Chinese food with the transvestites and the mafia girlfriends, and she can get the Kaneko story about graft and prostitution. But there's other stories that we cannot get. So the power of oral history, when it's good, it can be really good. And it can be reflected in a book like Clark and Division, which it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what I remember about when I read it. Is it? Oh, yeah, look at that!
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
Look, they did that.
Exactly. Yes.
That was what was fun for us. Yeah. Is that we read the oral histories and the thing is, we know Naomi well, and we know her other. She's got a lot of mystery series, not only this, is that she does not know Chicago. She knows California, and that's why, and this was not intended to be a sequel book, but everyone wanted a sequel to this story. They wanted a continuation of the story. And bringing it to Evergreen was easy for her because she's in Los Angeles. I mean, she was a Rafa Shimpo newspaper person. She knows that place. It's easy to find people who are buried there or the stories there or whatever. But this is new to her. She's not a Chicago person, but you have to be authentic, right? So how do you become authentic? You have to really figure out what Clark and Division's all about or what the story is, like that.
I think she had guides. So she used Eric Matsunaga, whose maps you're seeing, and then Bob Krumaki, another person that helped guide her.
But I'm saying she's reading oral history books. She's talking to a lot of people, so what was like living here like. So she knows people to talk to. I mean, that's how you find out the, the background.
So it's rooted in history, I would say. That's what's authentic about the book.
Yeah. Tries to make it authentic.
Can I ask a question? Please do. I was just going to say,
Okay.
audience.
I was actually curious, and I know this from a lot of different groups who have traumatic stories or migration. It's like sometimes there's always one generation who really wants to know a lot about it, and there's one generation who doesn't want to talk about it at all. So I'm curious to know for both of you if you would talk about like your families or your ancestors' reaction to your interest in researching this, and how you feel too, Mary, knowing that your daughter is also carrying on the legacy of researching this topic in Chicago.
Yeah. I think that my generation, the Sansei generation, the grandkids of the people that initially came, we came of age in like the 60s and the 70s. So if we hear at all about our parents and grandparents' camp experience, we go, why didn't you protest? Why didn't you put up a fuss? And Ross, when we talked to him, he said his father said, you were not there. You don't understand. So that's true. We don't. We're like the kids that protested Vietnam, march for civil rights. And so that is our way of understanding and being, having agency. So sometimes people will say about this camp experience, shikataganai, which is roughly translated as it can't be helped, which to me sounds like so much you're rolling over and playing dead. I've had another person, actually a person that I interviewed, who said she thinks of shikataganai as despite my best efforts that I tried to do something, this happened. So that's when we talk about camp, you'll hear my parents didn't talk about it. When they do talk about it, if they talk about it at all, shikataganai, but it means more than just it can't be helped. I think because our parents didn't talk to us about it, we internalize the silence as that is something bad. You don't talk to your parents about it, that there's shame, that there's grief, that there's anger, that they feel like they were culpable, which they weren't. So for sanseis like me, I think the way we begin to approach this topic, if we don't have relatives who will talk about it with us, is we start doing pilgrimages to the different camps. And, I myself have been on several. And there's a Tribune article where I'm talking about it I go with my daughter. So this is the Tribune article. So you might be able to guess that I'm somebody that like lives in her head. I don't really let my emotions guide me. I let my brain so I think I and many people who go on these camp pilgrimages are hoping to feel what our parents and grandparents felt. I've come to the sort of maybe radical position that I cannot feel what they felt. I can try to understand it. I can be empathic. But again, I'm kind of like still in my head. And so the way I know this is in 1988, I tried to interview my mother about her camp experience. And at that time, I'd been maybe like done 30 interviews. I can talk to my mom. I couldn't get past the demographics. I couldn't get past, tell me when Auntie Liddy was born, because I projected the hurt that she was going to tell me. So I think for me, I learned that, that sometimes you're too close. Sometimes you can't hear the stories because you don't want to hear your parents' pain. And that just completely shocked me. I think for my daughter's generation, it's a little different story. Some of them have known their grandparents, but they didn't know some of them have stories from their grandparents, but my daughter didn't. So for them, they start to talk about intergenerational trauma, that because no one talked about it, again, it must be something bad, and they use it as a springboard for social action, immigrant rights, refugee rights, shut down Guantanamo, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really small but mighty stream of social action that's going on now among people my daughter's generation. So she's like 30. And I really applaud them and the work that they do. So I think each generation either tells the story, doesn't tell the story, makes up the story, or uses it as a springboard for social action. And so I think each generation is, a little bit different tack. And so for me, I still grapple with the idea, like, what the heck is intergenerational trauma? And I go to more and more talks about it, and I'm beginning to understand how silence, again, can manifest as intergenerational trauma. And that, I think, is the hot topic among people my daughter's age.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have plenty more questions, but if anybody else wants to ask.
I have a question. It's a little bit more, it requires a little bit more context, but I'm assuming neither of you speak Japanese, or am I incorrect in that?
You are correct for me.
I do speak.
Oh, okay.
Not very well, but in camp I was bilingual, so I knew both languages. So to 5, I'd say it was pretty good. But once we come out of camp, everything Japanese is bad.
Yeah.
So we don't speak Japanese, or don't go to Japanese classes or anything like that. And I have, and there's a lot of prejudice. I mean, coming out of camp is a very difficult situation because they were at war with Japan, and they hated Japan for all those years. And then their families had people in the military, and maybe lost somebody in the military. So you come out, and they've been trained in their minds to hate, and they don't know the difference with Japan from Japan or from here or whatever. So there's a lot of prejudice. So I would say it was very difficult for me. I thought being Japanese had to be the worst thing in the world. You couldn't possibly be any worse than being Japanese, like that. So, yeah, but I speak it. But the other thing is I then later took Japanese as thing. But I quit. And the reason I quit is because if you really try to learn a language, when the concept comes, it comes in that language. So from the time I was young, when I have to say something in English, because the population was Japanese and couldn't understand English, I'm used to hearing the English, simplifying it, then saying it. I don't just say it because they're not going to understand me. It doesn't make any sense. But if you learn Japanese, now all of a sudden the thought comes to you, the answer comes to you in Japanese. And I'm a teacher. So not only I have to get that Japanese concept out, I got to get it in English, and I got to get simplified. It takes too much time. And Japanese are slow, or I'm slow. I'm very slow. In other words, American, the more to talk and the faster you talk, the better it is. In Japanese, silence is good. You're supposed to think before you talk. You're not supposed to talk. So if you're Japanese, you can be all day with no talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a language in itself, silence as a language. And
yes.
There are certain kinds of ways that I understand a Nisei lady that I knew that I really liked. And we would cook Japanese New Year's with her. And my generation is like trying really hard. And if she took the slightest breath like that, we knew we screwed up, So you have to learn how to read silence or these very small intonations and understand the meaning of those kinds of things. Not a word, but, a look or, yeah, I give my daughter the look, And so I think there's a silent language too. But I was going to say, for my generation, I feel like there was a cultural genocide, so that, like Alice said, you don't learn things that are Japanese. When my parents' generation came out, they also, whether this is true or not, believe that the government is telling them they cannot congregate. You can't be in groups bigger than 3.
That's a law.
No, it's not. The law says a gang is 3 or more. But the WRIA never said that. But people internalized it as if it were the fact.
Oh.
So, that's one of the reasons there was never a Japantown in Chicago, that they were told, don't congregate, don't make this kind of a community, and being very law-abiding, people didn't congregate. They didn't form a Japantown. There's a wonderful audio story on WBEZ. There was a show called Curious City. And so there's a segment on why wasn't there a Japantown in Chicago? And it was done by Catherine Nagasawa. It's excellent, excellent, excellent. And so she's really looking at Lakeview as kind of the anchor I highly recommend that. Yeah. So in my generation, I would say it's the odd person that speaks Japanese. The consequence is that for my daughter's generation, many of whom are mixed race, they feel that they are not good enough because they don't speak Japanese. And to me, that just breaks my heart that, how did you get that as a marker of ethnic identity? But it is something that's there, it's just that kind of surprised me. So.
Well, I have one last question, if you don't mind. We're going to close it up.
I'll allow it.
Okay, I was just going to say for us, I know I'm going to talk about this in a second, the field trip that we're going to do, which you had a part of, that I would love for you to share, but also like for us at Read and Run or anybody in Chicago, like what can we do to honor your family's histories and your stories and do justice to everything that you went through and lived?
Can I add, sorry, to that, because that's kind of similar to what no, that's great. My wrap-up question was going to be like, maybe like what's the one thing that you wish more Chicagoans knew about this? So just however you want to interpret, go with that,
Okay. So every year around February 19th, February 19th, 1942 is when Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that put our parents and families in these concentration camps. So every year we commemorate that at the History Museum. And it's always like the Sunday closest to February 19th. So we just had it 2 days ago. I would say that that's a way to learn more about the history. And we take very different approaches. Sometimes it's a lawyer that's going to talk about defending Supreme Court cases. Sometimes it's 2 years ago, it was an academic who has studied trauma by generations in conversation with a person my daughter's age who was a memoirist who talks about her mental health, and she understands her mental health or illness by understanding these Japanese spirits. And so that was a really interesting dialogue because you don't think a memoirist can talk to an academician, but it worked. This past Sunday, we had a woman who translated her grandparents' tanka, which is a kind of poetry, a little bit similar to haiku, but different numbers of lines and different syllable type things. And she spent 15 years doing that. So what happens when you have the grandparents' voice come through finally in English, these are people that, like for me, have been hidden in plain sight. And so translations of these sorts of things, whether they're novels or diaries or poetry, gives a whole nother view of what happened to a generation that I really don't know much about the internal life of what they went through. So I think every year we do a different topic. And it's a coalition of organizations that always puts it on. So I think that is unique. Chicago is the only group that we know of that has a coalition of organizations. Typically, it's one organization puts on their day of remembrance. They might have another competing organization that puts it on the same day. So I think we'd like to think of ourselves as the community that's always been very cooperative. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's how we pat ourselves on the back. But Day of Remembrance, mid-February, Chicago History Museum. Yeah.
The other thing is there is an exhibit right now at the Holocaust Museum that, if people would like to see something, they're
going
up to date. Are you going to run on that day?
We're not going to run. We're going to go visit.
But I think, but they have the last Friday of every month free, and so you can go there, and some of their programs are free. But there is a Japanese exhibit now with 6 current
eight artists.
Eight, even more, so even better. 8 artists that are talking about this, now their view of camp, their view of life. And so we have some of the old kinds of concepts that like Daruma, but this is a new way of looking at it, and how they look at camp or what they feel about it like that. So I think it's really interesting. So I'd say go on the free day.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or pay $18 on April 12th.
And then when you're in there, often when we bring exhibits to Chicago, we try to add a Chicago story. So there's a sort of an ancillary little exhibit that's marked by this lovely kimono quilt that Alice was also part of, called Chicago is Home. It was done by maybe 15 women in 2001. And so I look at this quilt as also another kind of stitched history, an oral history, where the women are telling how Chicago became home for them. And it's an absolute gem of an artifact. And then there's pictures on the wall, including Alice's picture, of resettlement era pictures, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
the Japanese after camp and what was resettlement like.
Yeah.
So, but it's really just the beginning years. So I think it's from 1945 to 55 or 60, something like that. It's not later. It's just right after coming out of camp.
Yeah. And so I'd say that historians, Japanese Americans historians now would say the resettlement era goes from roughly 1943 to roughly 1965. So when we talk about resettlement, that's really the time frame that we're talking about.
Thank you
Oh.
so much.
Well,
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow. Oh, they're beautiful. Thank
Thank
you.
you for not being.
Announcements
But
to
I want to say
close.
one thing.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for not being scary.
Oh, we're very nice. I promise.
I know. That's what she said.
I was wondering, would it be possible for you to shift over here so we can take a group photo?
Sure.
Okay, if possible, and I can.
Sure.
have your-
Sure.
your hands.
Yeah. Oh, and I have 3 of my books, and 3 of my books if you want to buy them. So it's $20 a copy. Okay, so I can sit over here.